Good morning. My name is Dr. Natalie Kertes Weaver, and I'm a professor of theology and religious studies at Ursuline College in Pepper Pike, Ohio. I'm coming to you this morning remotely from my office in University Heights, Ohio, to present the third in the four-part series, Examining Conscience and Christian Narrative. So, welcome to the day. I hope you are all well and healthy this morning and doing okay during this quarantine. And this session is tackling the idea of conscience and conflict in Christian character. So the session today is aimed at exploring the tensions of conscience and formation in Christian character, looking at famously storied lives and seeing how that conflict produces growth. So through the lens of notable Christian figures who brought their consciences to action in crisis contexts in Christian history, we can examine the development and the formation and the reformation of relevant and just applications of Christian faith in society. Our goal today is to consider three famously storied lives and then to evaluate how their consciences produced change and growth in the church community. So before we even begin to talk about famously storied lives, I think it's important to remember that the larger discussion we're having here is around narrative. And narrative is what we've got. We embody and live our stories. Even our concept of the past, our concept of history, is a little skewed if we have in our mind some ongoing past reality that is somehow extant but stands outside of ourselves, such that we could access it if we got into, a really fancy telephone booth or some other kind of time travel machine and plugged in the right coordinates, and we could go back 500 years or 1,000 years or 200 years, and it would still be there. Rather, what we have at any given point is the present, and the story that we tell about the past is actually a present tense event. It's the manner of our remembering, and it's really remembering itself is an important word. We are remembering, reconstituting, pulling back together, reassembling a number of pieces of data with our own inflections, with our own preferences, with our own limitations, with the limitations in our research, perhaps the limitations in our prejudices and what we prefer and don't prefer to include, that we may know or not know, that is, we may be cognizant or not cognizant of data that might be important in shaping the truth of something. And in this way, we try and come up with a constructed idea of what was. And so we actually live story all of the time. Right now, during this coronavirus crisis that we're all experiencing, I have found myself looking into past health crises in the world, and I realize we're reading stories, and we have storied how those things played out. And so it's an excellent example, a learning moment for us to be aware of how we shape story in the present, and we might confuse it for the fact itself or the thing in itself, but it really isn't. And so telling stories, telling heroic stories, is an extremely important part of a group identity. So when we look at Christian character and stories, and we remember those stories, we are engaged in a critical work of remembering, reconstituting in a vital way the life of the community. So the first heroic story that I would like to discuss with you is the story of Hagar in the book of Genesis. So Hagar is an Egyptian handmaid to Sarah. And as we know, Sarah is advanced in age and therefore unlikely to conceive a child. And so it is an accommodation for such a one in Hebrew custom that she can present to her husband, Abraham, her handmaid, and the child that might come from this union would be the legal heir. So she sends Hagar to then Abram. And they conceive this child. And Hagar is not here represented in the most favorable light. She is reported to have become despising of her mistress when she knows that she's pregnant. And therefore Sarah is frustrated, and she goes to Abraham and says, look what you've done. And Abram says, you take your slave back. It's up to you. Treat her, do whatever you think is best with her. And so then Sarah in turn mistreats Hagar, and Hagar decides to run into the desert and to flee the situation. So this is all recounted in Genesis 16. And when Hagar flees, we learn, this is in verse 7, that the angel of the Lord found Hagar near a spring in the desert. It was the spring that is beside the road to Shur. And he said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from, and where are you going? I am running away from my mistress, Sarai, she answered. Then the angel of the Lord told her, go back to your mistress and submit to her. The angel added, I will increase your descendants so much that they will be too numerous to count. And the angel of the Lord also said to her, you are now pregnant, and you will give birth to a son. You shall name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be ever against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all of his brothers. She gave this name to the Lord who spoke to her. You are the God who sees me. For she said, I have now seen the one who sees me. That is why the well was called Ber Laharoi. It is still there, between Kertes and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram gave the name Ishmael to the son she had born. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore him Ishmael. So it continues in Genesis that that Sarah indeed will become pregnant and will give birth to Isaac. And when Sarah gives birth to Isaac, she wants to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael. I mean, at this point, Ishmael is the firstborn son and would be a threat to her son. And so she decides to drive out Hagar and Ishmael back into the desert. And so now into the 21st chapter of Genesis, we learn that the child grew and was weaned. And on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar, the Egyptian, had borne to Abraham was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. This matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God had said, do not be distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. So early the next morning, Abraham took some food and a skin of water and gave them to Hagar, and he set them on her shoulders and then sent her off with the boy. And she went on her way and wandered to the desert of Beersheba. When the water and the skin was gone, she put the boy under one of the bushes, and then she went off and sat down about a bow shot away, for she thought, I cannot watch the boy die. And as she sat there, she began to sob. God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God said to Hagar from heaven, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. And then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and so she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. God was with the boy as he grew up, and he lived in the desert and became an archer. While he was living in the desert of Paran, his mother got a wife for him from Egypt. So that's the story. And it's not the most oft-told story of Abraham and his faithfulness. Certainly Isaac gets far more attention. But it's an important story, and it has important theological potential. And so I'm sharing this particular story with you because of the way that it is used as a tool to drive and affirm the function of conscience and the resolution of conflict in a contemporary theological discourse. The character Hagar behaves in a very self-authoring way. She leaves. When she is mistreated, she takes off. And she goes into the desert with her son, and she has this encounter with God, whom she names. So she uses the power of her voice and speech to speak to God and to give God a name. And she responds to God's direction to return. And she does so and lives in the state that probably is less than desirable for her until she is driven out again. And when she is in the desert a second time, God now provides to her the water that she needs to keep her son alive. And we learn that she eventually returns to Egypt, or gets from Egypt a wife for her son. So she is arranging a marriage for her son with her own people. So this is a powerful story of a woman acting in a strong agential way, in a survivalist mode for herself and her offspring. And she doesn't have a lot of people looking after her. In fact, she has powerful people taking advantage of her and using her for her reproductivity, and then mistreating her, and then eventually casting her out. So why is this story theologically important? African American feminist scholar Dolores Williams looks at the story of Hagar as a vital retelling of gospel messaging for people who come out of contexts of oppression. And she uses this story as an analog to the experience of enslaved women in U.S. history, who also had no reproductive autonomy, whose bodies were exploited for their sexual and reproductive capacity, who were dependent on their masters for their survival, who were subject to maltreatment and abuse and physical abuse, and who were often despised for having their relationships with male slave owners by the women who were the proper wives of those men, and whose labor was exploited and used, and in the end who had to make strong decisions for themselves, for their own survival and the survival of their children. And she considers this a kind of response to the message of Christianity that was insidiously used to keep enslaved persons spiritually enslaved by confirming their sacrifice as Christ-like, and also by confirming their obligation to be subordinate and surrogate by the thinking that, well, Jesus was a surrogate for our sins, and so to behave in a surrogate way is in fact a kind of graced thing to do. And this is a very distorting theology. And so Hagar looks at this story, and she, in a work called Sisters in the Wilderness, really reclaims its value and its potential as a story of liberation that speaks first to God addressing people in their most basic needs for survival, which sometimes means that you have to stay in a situation that you're in for a time being. And yet God provides, and God is with you, and God sees you. And that at the right moment, God will empower your liberation as God empowers Hagar's liberation and cares for her and her son while they are her in the desert, and encourages her so that she can grow to a fulfillment of a quality of life that the future holds, and which is sort of foretold in her procurement of a wife for her son. So this is a great example of how story, which has, I would say, useful but limited detail and also limited play in the biblical narratives. It's not the story of King David. It's a far more minor account in the larger story of the patriarchs of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. So it's a sort of sidebar. But for a different population of readers, it can become an incredibly important story that speaks to the heart of God's work in the world and can be reclaimed and retold anew in a way that continues to give life and corrective revisioning to a community by addressing the theological inadequacies of a theology of surrogate sacrifice for a people who were forced into surrogate sacrifice. This kind of reading of Scripture, this kind of re-narratizing, enables the Scripture to continue to be valuably informative, while at the same time to resist readings that confirm abusive structures. So it's a great example of narrative and the power of narrative to be reclaimed in a way that affirms conscience so that the community can form itself in a more wholesome way in the present and in the future. So the second heroic story that I would like to share with you is that of Constantine the Great and his relationship with Christianity. So Constantine was the emperor of Rome in the 4th century from the years 306 to 337. And he is credited with transitioning Christianity from its pre-Christian, formerly referred to as pagan character, to becoming a Christian empire. And historians dispute what the nature of Constantine's Christian experience was. Some believe that he was probably raised Christian and had an early kind of Christianity that he adopted from his mother, while others attribute his Christianity to a dramatic battlefield revelation that inspired him, led him to victory, and confirmed his own character as a Christian and led him to spread Christian policies throughout the Roman Empire. So he definitely is, known for having passed this Edict of Milan in the year 313, which established freedom from persecution for Christians, and also established a kind of religious liberty. It seems like a very modern document for others. And so it was a kind of great toleration that came from this edict. And he also is credited with being a patron of the early Christian church. So he is responsible for the establishment of basilicas, for creating some privileges for clergy, financially exemptions for taxes and things like that, elevating Christians in office, and in particular returning to Christians properties that had been confiscated during periods of persecution. And so he has this kind of great Christian character that is associated with him, and the establishment of a sort of a popular Christianity and an imperial Christianity. So the question of his Christian character is raised by historians who are critically interested in it, because his life is mostly recorded by Eusebius, who isn't really writing a straight biography. So Eusebius's work portrays Constantine in particularly glowing terms, and he does not, he neglects certain details which could, otherwise shed some more critical light on what Constantine did and why he did it. One of the most important things that happened for early Christianity under Constantine was that the First Council of Nicaea was convened in the year 325, and it was a very important council. It continues to be extremely important theologically for Christians all over the world today, because it was at this council that the relationship of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit as three persons in one God was articulated. That this terrible debate that had been raging among the bishops about who Jesus, what he was, who he was in relationship to God the Father, was being ironed out at this Council of Nicaea. And Eusebius himself attended this council and became a kind of champion of the Nicene language and position that followed, as many others did. And so materials that come from this period tend to have a strong PR quality to them. I don't want to go so far as to say propaganda, but they are definitely doing public relations and carrying forward a message. And that message is a Nicene Christianity. So Eusebius's treatment of Constantine's life is really to demonstrate that Constantine is placed here by God for the purpose of delivering this kind of Christian message to end Christian persecutions, that is, the persecution of Christians, and to establish a Christian character to the Roman Empire. And it's fantastic. It's a fantastic examination of narrative, because we see a real person with a real life and a real history, whose story is greatly amplified to teach a theological message. So this is some of the language that we get from Constantine himself, from Eusebius on the life of Constantine, describing this incredible conversion moment that he has that confirms his Christianity. So this comes from the 27th and 28th chapters of the Unfinished Life of Constantine by Eusebius. So he says here, being convinced, however, that he needed some more powerful aid than his military forces could afford him on account of the wicked and magical enchantments which were so diligently practiced by the tyrant, he sought divine assistance, deeming the possession of arms and a numerous soldiery of secondary importance, but believing the co-operating deity invincible and not to be shaken. He considered, therefore, on what God he might rely for protection and assistance. While engaged in this inquiry, the thought occurred to him that of the many emperors who had preceded him, those who had rested their hopes in a multitude of gods and served them with sacrifices and offerings had in the first place been deceived by flattering predictions and oracles which promised them all prosperity and at last had met with an unhappy end. And while not one of their gods had stood by to warn them of the impending wrath of heaven, while one alone who had pursued an entirely opposite course, who had condemned their error and honored the one supreme God during his whole life, had found him to be the savior and protector of his empire and the giver of every good thing. Reflecting on this, and well weighing the fact that they who had trusted in many gods had also fallen by manifold forms of death without leaving behind them either family or offspring or stock or name or memorial among men, while the God of his father had given to him, on the other hand, manifestations of his power and very many tokens, And considering farther that those who had already taken arms against the tyrant and had marched to the battlefield under the protection of a multitude of gods had met with a dishonorable end, reviewing, I say, all these considerations, he judged it to be folly, indeed, to join in the idol worship of those who were no gods, and after such convincing evidence to err from the truth, and therefore felt it incumbent upon him to honor his father's God alone. Accordingly, he called on him with earnest prayer and supplications, that he would reveal to him who he was, and stretch forth his right hand to help him in his present difficulties. And while he was thus praying with fervent entreaty, a most marvelous sign appeared to him from heaven, the account of which it might have been hard to believe had it been related by any other person. But since the victorious emperor himself long afterwards declared it to the writer of this history, so Eusebius is telling us, he told me this personally. He directly told me this. So declared it to the writer of this history when he was honored with his acquaintance in society and confirmed his statement by an oath. Who could hesitate to accredit the relation, especially since the testimony of aftertime had established its truth? He said that about noon, when the day was already beginning to decline, he saw with his own eyes the trophy of a cross of light in the heavens above the sun and bearing the inscription, "Conquer by this." And at this sight he himself was struck with an amazement, and his whole army also, which followed him on this expedition and witnessed the miracle. And so we learn that this leads him to being victorious in battle, and this then confirms for Constantine his Christian character and leads him to all of these great Christian initiatives. So this is a wonderful story of a great Christian hero whose story then is used to theologically validate, or rather to validate the theological innovations of the community. Now, is this a time of crisis? And it definitely is a time of certainly a time of tension and perhaps a time of crisis, and absolutely an expression of conscience. So what is happening during this time period? You have these great theological debates going on, and what is at risk is the integrity of the developing Christian faith. People are excommunicating each other and, name calling each other and, really kind of disgruntled over these major doctrinal questions about who Jesus is. And they risk falling into a variety of what would later be deemed kind of heretical camps. So to get everybody on the same page and to have a consensus in creed, we need a leader who is noteworthy, honorable, reliable, and who can be confirmed as an authentic voice. And using a great story of conversion and dependence on God in battle, and seeing this as the work of God that leads this man into a place of leadership so that he can get everybody on the right page. This is a narrative about the history of Christianity that sees a through line from start to finish, and wants to make sure everybody understands that and gets that point. And so by using the story of Constantine as the lever to confirm these theological innovations, Eusebius gives us a wonderful account, albeit one that most scholars consider to be kind of historically unreliable. Not because it's all false, but because it is so mixed, a combination of historical material as well as the sort of hagiographical, superlative, inflated narrative. But it works rhetorically, and it becomes an important anchor for the developing community and what will become its orthodox theology. So the third heroic narrative that we're going to talk about in this series is that of the life of Thomas Merton. Now, this is a difficult choice to land here rather than somewhere else, because there are so many important stories in our tradition. I consider talking about St. Augustin of Hippo in his Confessions, who tells a tale of his journey toward Christianity. It's, as we discussed before, a polemical work that is in disputation of the suggestion that we can approach God on our own without grace. And so it has a theologically driven purpose, but it is a record of Augustine's life, his false beliefs, his challenges as he comes increasingly to know who God is and to discover God within himself, to remember God even within himself. So it's a great story, and it's really impactful on Christian thinkers throughout the tradition. So not only is it directly impactful for people who read it today, but it was impactful on other shapers of our faith tradition. So then I also thought about talking about Martin Luther, the great reformer, whose journey toward reform ideas is attached closely by his biographers and by scholars who consider his doctrinal developments that is attached closely to his psychology and his own personal struggles. And so he has a kind of confession experience and conversion experience, as well as he has a deliverance from what he believes to be wrong reading of Scripture, wrong reading of Romans, to the enlightened one, which teaches him a more acceptable theology of God's grace. Then I considered some more contemporary shapers of Christian ideals, such as Mother Teresa or Dorothy Day. So figures who have a very strong social justice component in their life narratives. But I thought I would save those two for our fourth session for next week, looking at Christian story and the public conscience. So I also considered C.S. Lewis, who is a great figure for me because he has such a copious library of offerings for Christian readers. And while he does not consider himself an esoteric and elite theologian, he really is. I mean, he's a popular theologian, but he is extremely well versed in the tradition and really relatable. And he has such a great storytelling quality in his work, and he is so connected with fantasy and myth that he is able to bring these Christian elements through in direct works of theology and also in these indirect allegories and fiction works, which are deeply beloved by readers all over the world. So he's a great figure to consider as well, because he, while raised a Christian, repudiates it only to come back to it, and he recounts his conversion experience many times, and it's actually the strength of that conversion experience which gives him so much confidence in his Christian writings. But I thought that it might be very appropriate to mention the life of Thomas Merton. And once again, we have a sort of confessional tale, which is his autobiography. So he records his story. So he self-narrates, and it's another witness to how important the self-storied Christian journey is, not only as like a witness to oneself or a discovery of one's own path toward God, but as a sort of galvanizing force for other people's faith. And Merton's Seven-Story Mountain is a surprising autobiographical success in the middle of the 20th century, which has this really broad appeal and reaches hundreds of thousands, pretty instantly, hundreds of thousands of readers. And so why is this work successful? And why do people really care to read it? And I think it's because it's a personal narrative about striving for meaning during a time, truly a time of crisis. So written right after the Second World War and right after humanity has discovered what our military technologies can do, the devastating scope of thermonuclear weapons. And we understand now the brink of annihilation that we can lead ourselves to. A world that has a different character and texture and value from the world that we woke up in, a few years prior. To have a person recounting his journey toward faith in this moment, brilliantly connected with the spiritual needs of readers all over the world. And so it really was a first major Catholic voice in that era that had the ability to connect with a disillusioned 20th century audience, a war-weary and fearful audience, dealing with the frightful developments of the 20th century military complex. So it's also an interesting work because Merton himself is catapulted into international fame as a spiritual writer. So there's a tremendous irony in the juxtaposition of this monastic, quiet, internal, introspective journey and fame, and the kind of silent life of the cloistered monk and the literary discussions that the book propels him into. And so toward the end of his life, he looks at his journey in this book and he doesn't really even recognize himself in it. And so he can almost treat it as though it were another author, another person who wrote this. So he can have a kind of objective discussion of it and, in fact, distances himself from this work. Doesn't even see himself in it in the end. And it's an interesting experience. As an author myself, I have had that experience where I will read something from myself, even something published, and it is no longer my own voice. It has become, something of the past. And so that itself is an interesting component of narrative, because we take these sort of snapshots of a person's journey or a person's thought at any given moment in time, and once they become concretized in some product, some written or published or spoken product that is captured, they tend to have a kind of reified quality, which is not consistent with the developmental experience of a human person's story. So it's just a moment, it's a fixed moment, but it's, it very well may be that is no longer true to a person's ongoing narrative. So Thomas Mertens Seven-Story Mountain is a confessional work of the 20th century, and it has all of the power of these classic historical works from the deep past, but it has particular relevance because it is an example of how a narrative can connect with people in a world that is somewhat distanced from those values. And it speaks powerfully because those elements are still in us and seeking to be addressed and spoken to. So the personal narrative, the personal confession, is absolutely essential to awakening that, or not even awakening it, but to connecting that in myself with that in another. And there's a Jungian concept. So the Viennese psychoanalyst Carl Jung, who did wonderful work with his patients, and I think what I appreciate most about him was that he didn't really pathologize the neuroses of the people that he worked with, but rather he validated their experience and sat with them in their experience, and he quite ardently argued that the problem was really the kind of isolation of those experiences, and once they could be externalized, and particularly if they could be connected with something on the outside, there was no longer a crisis. There was a healing that occurred because the person understood that he or she was not having this, private disclosure, this private revelation, this private experience, but that it was validated extrinsically in the connection with someone else's experience. And I think that's kind of what the Seven-Story Mountain does, is it gives, and I guess that's what confessions do, they give us an opportunity to speak to each other about these parts of ourselves which are, I guess, in ways silenced by the mainstream dialogues that we have to have in professional life and in public life. And so, is this an example of crisis or conflict? And I suppose the answer is yes, in a very huge way, in a sense, in that it's a response to the spiritual crises that come in the wake of the wars of the 20th century. But in a much more persistent and almost subtle way, I think this work speaks to the crisis of conscience and culture, when the culture and its values are disconnected with these very fundamental creaturely needs to be in quiet, contemplative relationship with God. And so this is an expression of how that journey is experienced, and in speaking it, it enables his readers to experience their own, and to perhaps overcome some of that disconnected, alienated kind of feeling by recognizing that there is at least one other who has had that similar walk. So we've considered three great characters in Christian history and their stories. Hagar, who is an Old Testament figure, but is revisited in contemporary womanist theology for the revisionist theological possibilities that can lead to a liberated spiritual imagination and relationship with God for those coming out of oppressed historical contexts. We considered the story of Constantine the Great and the manner in which a hero of the faith can be used to endorse and shape theological commitments for both the present and the future in a way that is actively and conscientiously intending to produce a cohesive understanding in the community. And we considered the life of Thomas Merton as a story of faith journeying in a world that doesn't make sense. These are three of countless examples of how Christian narrative can address the needs of a community in a formative way and in a reformative way, in a way that speaks to the conscience of the reader as well as the speaker, the conscience of the community, and can help to both discover and ground anew faith in situations and in contexts where we need that kind of encouragement. So story is crucial to formation and reformation of our characters, and is usually prompted by some contrast that needs address. And so in the telling of a story, we arrive at a more relevant and hopefully more just way of understanding Christian life in the world. Next week, our discussion focuses on Christian story and the public conscience. And our goal will be to consider how storytelling is part of our liturgical work and our public presentation of ourselves. In that publicness, we discover that we have a responsibility, not just to our own souls or to the faith of the people in our community, but to the larger context in which we engage and apply ourselves in life and work and in our societal choices. And so we want to consider Christian storytelling in historical developmental perspective. And our goal will be to evaluate how we can bring our narratives into a more responsible engagement with the world. So I want to thank you for spending some more time with me today. I want to address that in my previous slide when I was discussing Carl Jung, I referred to him as Viennese, and he's actually Swiss. So that's an error. Sorry, I caught it when I listened to my recording of myself playing myself back. And I just wish you all the best. It's a really difficult time, we all know, and I know people are feeling kind of isolated, and they're starting to wonder how long this quarantine is going to last, and it's scary. So I encourage you all, and I've been getting this message a lot from my students who are, and they're in ministry. My students are, most of them, the graduate students are in formation for ministry, and they're finding themselves in really strange situations. They're, bringing mass to the public, and their new job is to get a microphone and get the technology set up. I have a student who does funeral liturgies, and they're no longer allowed to conduct funerals. So she's trying to find ways of meaningfully being present to people and providing that kind of funerary ministry in the absence of ministry. So the big question on everybody's mind is how do we remain church when we can't come together? I listened to an online forum of Jewish leaders who were considering the problem of Jewish prayer when they can't convene as a quorum. So we've got a lot of challenges as people of faith in these days ahead of us, and I keep encouraging all of my students, in part because they're students, but in part because I think it's really important to capture this. I keep encouraging them to write, to document what they're experiencing and how they're addressing it, because one person's experience may really powerfully help someone else and may give an insight or a little trick or something that's going to help someone else connect in a time of real need. So I hope that you also will participate in that and keep track of your own experiences and make sure that you're making a record of what this is like, so that our wisdom from these days is preserved and can be shared, and hopefully can help build up the community now and also into the future. So until next week, I wish you all the best. I encourage you to contact me and reach out if you have questions or discussions that you would like me to include in our next session on Christian story and public conscience. And until then, God bless you and have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.